The sound of heavy boots echoed through the long, dimly lit hallway of Fort Kingsley, one of the most disciplined military bases in the country. Cadet Emily Carter, only 22, marched nervously toward the locker room. She had just finished another grueling training session, her uniform soaked with sweat, her hands trembling from exhaustion. Emily was strong. She had survived a rough childhood, growing up in foster homes, fighting for every bit of respect she had. But nothing had prepared her for the cruelty of Colonel Richard Harlow. Harlow was a decorated officer, feared and respected by everyone on the base. His voice could silence a crowd of soldiers in seconds, but behind closed doors, his arrogance was toxic. That evening, Emily had barely stepped inside the locker room when the colonel appeared. His eyes burned with rage. "Carter," he barked, "you think you're better than my men? You think a little girl like you belongs here?" Emily froze. She didn't answer. She knew better, but the colonel's face twisted into a cruel grin. In one sudden motion, he shoved her toward the restroom stalls, his grip like steel. Before she could resist, he forced her head down into a toilet full of filthy water. Thought the icy shock stole her breath. She gasped, choked, her lungs screaming for air. The humiliation burned worse than the water stinging her eyes. When he finally released her, she staggered back, drenched and trembling. The colonel sneered, his voice low and venomous. "Remember this, Carter, this base isn't for the weak. If you can't handle this, you don't belong here." Emily's fists clenched. Tears blurred her vision, but something inside her snapped. She wasn't weak. She had survived worse. And this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. The room spun with shame and fury. She walked out without a word, but in her heart, a storm had begun to rise, one that would shake the base to its core. The night was eerily quiet at Fort Kingsley. The base usually buzzed with chatter, drills, and the sharp bark of orders, but tonight, Emily Carter lay awake on her bunk, staring at the cracked ceiling above her. Her hair was still damp from earlier. The stench of humiliation, refusing to leave her skin. The colonel's cruel laugh echoed in her head like a broken record. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to force the memory away. But instead of tears, something else rose within her fire. Emily Carter wasn't born into comfort. She didn't grow up with medals hanging on walls or parents cheering from the stands. She had grown up in foster homes, shuffling from one family to the next, always the outsider, always the kid who didn't belong. She had learned one thing in those years: if you don't fight for yourself, no one else will. The colonel thought he had broken her, but Emily knew better. He had just awakened something that had been waiting all along. The next morning, she didn't flinch when she saw him during roll call. She didn't bow her head or avoid his glare. Instead, she stood straighter, her jaw set like stone. "Cadet Carter," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Did you sleep well after your wash?" A few cadets snickered nervously, but Emily didn't react. She met his eyes, unblinking. For a moment, the colonel faltered, as if surprised by her silence. Inside, however, Emily was already working. She carried a small notebook, hidden in the lining of her rucksack. Every insult, every abusive act, every unprofessional order, she wrote them all down, word for word. It was dangerous. If caught, she could be discharged on the spot. But Emily knew that silence was worse than punishment. Days turned into weeks, and whispers began circling through the barracks. Soldiers noticed how Emily endured the colonel's taunts without breaking. Some thought she was foolish. Others thought she was fearless. One evening, as she folded her uniform, a quiet voice broke the silence. "You're not the only one he's done this to." Emily looked up. Maya Torres, another cadet, stood by the doorway, her eyes dark and heavy. Emily's heart skipped. "He to you too." Maya nodded slowly. "Not the toilet, but other things. He uses fear like a weapon." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You're not crazy for keeping notes. I've been doing the same." For the first time since the humiliation, Emily felt a strange relief. She wasn't alone. The storm inside her had found its lightning. 2 cadets, 2 voices, and soon, they would not be ignored. The base cafeteria buzzed with the usual chatter, metal trays clattering, boots scraping against the floor, soldiers laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Emily sat quietly at the corner table, her food untouched. Across from her, Maya Torres kept her eyes low, as though even being seen with Emily might draw unwanted attention. But beneath the table, Maya's fingers tapped nervously against her knee. Emily leaned closer, whispering, "You still keeping notes?" Maya gave a sharp nod. "Every word, every threat. I don't know how long we can keep this hidden." Emily's jaw tightened. "Long enough. We'll need more than just 2 voices if we want to be heard." Before Maya could answer, a gruff voice interrupted. "You're right about that." Emily froze. Slowly, she turned her head. Standing behind them was Sergeant Daniels, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s. With a scar running down his cheek and eyes that had seen too much, he set his tray on their table without asking, his voice low and gravelly. "Harlow's been a disease on this base for years, but nobody dares touch him." Emily studied him carefully. "And why are you telling us this?" Daniels leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I've watched him destroy good soldiers. Men who should have had careers. Women who quit in shame. You two aren't the first." but you might be the first with the guts to fight back. Maya's eyes widened. You believe us? Daniels gave a bitter laugh. Believe you, kid, I've got a list longer than your notebook. Drills that turned into punishments. Missions he botched, but blamed on others. Soldiers who left broken. If you're keeping records, then maybe just maybe we can finally bury this bastard. That night, in the dim light of the barracks, the three of them gathered quietly. Emily spread her notebook across the table. Maya added her pages. And Daniel slid forward a battered folder thick with old reports. Each page was a story. Each line, a scar. He's untouchable, Maya whispered, almost afraid to hope. Daniels shook his head. No one's untouchable. He just thinks he is. The question is, do you have the stomach for what comes next? Because once you go after a man like Harlow, there's no turning back. Emily's hands trembled as she closed her notebook. She thought of her foster homes, of all the people who had told her she was worthless, of the colonel's hands shoving her face into filthy water. Her voice was steady when she answered, I'm not backing down. For the first time in weeks, Daniels smiled. It wasn't warm, it was sharp, dangerous. Good, then we've got ourselves a war. The wind howled across the training field that night, cold and merciless. The cadets stood in rigid lines, their uniforms damp with sweat and rain. Floodlights cut through the darkness, casting long, eerie shadows. Colonel Harlow's voice thundered over the storm. Run it again. The soldiers groaned quietly. They had already done the obstacle course 5 times. Mud clung to their boots. Their muscles screamed for rest. But nobody dared argue, not when Harlow's eyes burned like that. Emily Carter's lungs were on fire. She vaulted the wall, crawled under barbed wire, and forced her body to keep moving. Each breath felt like shards of glass. But still, she pushed. Behind her, Harlow barked, faster, Carter, or maybe I'll give you another bath. The cadets snickered, though uneasily. Everyone knew the story by now, the humiliation in the locker room. Emily kept her head down, jaw clenched, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. By the 6th round, her legs threatened to give out. She stumbled, dropping to her knees in the mud. Pathetic, Harlow sneered, striding toward her. This is why women don't belong here. Before Emily could rise, he grabbed her vest and yanked her to her feet. His grip was iron, his face inches from hers. You think you're tough? You're nothing, and I'll prove it. Then, in front of the entire unit, he shoved her backward into the flooded ditch beside the course. The icy water swallowed her in an instant. Emily gasped, thrashing, mud and water filling her mouth. For a terrifying second, she thought she wouldn't surface, but she did. Coughing, drenched, humiliated again. The colonel loomed above her, smirking. If you can't crawl out, Carter, then drown. The other cadets froze. No one moved. No one helped. Fear shackled them all. But Emily dragged herself out of the ditch, her body trembling, her eyes blazing with something new. She wasn't broken this time. She was furious. Daniel stepped forward, his fists clenched. He wanted to intervene, but Emily's glare stopped him. She stood, mud dripping from her uniform, water pooling at her boots. And then, for the first time, she spoke back. You can try to drown me, sir, she said, her voice raw but steady, but you'll never silence me. The words cut through the night like a blade. For a moment, even the storm seemed to pause. That night, Emily sat in the barracks, her hair still damp, her body aching. Maya pressed an ice pack to her shoulder. Daniels sat across from her, silent, watching. Finally, Daniels spoke. That was it, the breaking point. He won't stop now. Next time, he'll go further. Emily looked up, her voice like steel. Then we make sure there isn't a next time. Maya's hand trembled as she placed her notebook beside Emily's. Daniels slid his folder across the table. The 3 of them exchanged a single look. The fight was no longer about survival. It was about justice. Injustice was coming. The rain had stopped by morning, but the tension inside Fort Kingsley hadn't. The cadets whispered about what had happened at the training field. Some admired Emily's defiance. Others shook their heads, convinced she had just signed her own discharge papers. Emily didn't care. She was done being silent. That evening, in the dim light of the old storage room, Emily, Maya, and Sergeant Daniels huddled together. Daniels carried something under his arm, an old, battered folder sealed with a faded red stamp. He dropped it on the table with a heavy thud. Dust puffed into the air. Maya's eyes widened. What is that? Daniels's face was grim. Harlow's history, the stuff they don't put in the official record. Emily leaned forward, her heart pounding. Daniels opened the folder. Inside were reports, dozens of them. Complaints from soldiers. Records of injuries during training sessions that should never have happened. Allegations of harassment. Even testimonies that mysteriously went missing. Emily flipped through the pages, her hands trembling. These are years old. Why wasn't he stopped? Daniels's jaw tightened. Because men like him have connections, friends in high places. Every time someone spoke up, the reports disappeared. The soldiers either quit or were silenced. Maya swallowed hard. So if we speak up, we'll be silenced too. Emily slammed the file shut. Her eyes burned with fury. Not this time. Not if we do it together. Daniels gave a slow nod. If we can get this into the right hands command outside the base, maybe even the press Harlow's finished. But Emily knew the risk. If they were caught with the file, they could be charged with theft of classified documents. Prison wasn't out of the question. Still, when she thought of Harlow's hand forcing her head into the toilet, when she felt the memory of drowning in the ditch, her fear hardened into resolve. "We take him down," she whispered, "no matter what it costs." Later that night, Emily sat on her bunk, staring at the folder. Around her, the barracks were quiet. Cadets lost in uneasy sleep. She thought of the little girl she once was, the foster kid no one wanted, the girl who had been told she'd never be strong enough, never be worthy. And she thought of every soldier who had walked away, broken because no one stood up to Colonel Harlow. Emily clenched her fists. This isn't just about me anymore, it was about every voice that had been drowned out, every career destroyed, every silent tear shed behind locked doors. And now, for the first time, silence was about to end. The sun hung low over Fort Kingsley, bleeding orange light across the training grounds. Cadets gathered for another drill, their nerves stretched tight. Whispers rippled through the ranks. Everyone knew something was brewing. Emily Carter stood at the far end of the field, her uniform crisped, her jaw set. The secret folder with Harlow's history was locked away, but tonight wasn't about paper. Tonight was about truth. Colonel Harlow stormed across the field, his boots pounding like drums of war. His eyes locked on Emily, sharp with hatred. "Carter," he barked, "front and center." Emily marched forward, the entire base watching. Harlow sneered. "You think you're tough, don't you? Talking back, acting like you belong here. But you're nothing, and I'll prove it right here, right now." He ordered the cadets into a combat drill, pairing Emily with a much larger soldier. It was meant to break her. Everyone could see that. The whistle blew. The soldier lunged. Emily ducked, rolled, and countered with lightning speed. The crowd gasped as she flipped him to the ground. Harlow's face twisted in rage. Again, the soldier came harder this time, but Emily held her ground. She fought with precision, fueled not by anger, but by years of survival. When the soldier hit the dirt a second time, the cadets began to murmur. Some even cheered. Harlow's fury boiled over. He shoved the soldier aside and stepped into the ring himself. "You want to prove you belong, Carter? Prove it against me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. No cadet had ever been challenged by a colonel before. Emily's heart pounded, but she stood tall. "Yes, sir." The fight was brutal. Harlow struck hard, his blows meant to humiliate, not just test. But Emily absorbed the pain, her body remembering every foster home fight, every moment of struggle. She refused to fall. Then, in a flash, she countered, sidestepping his strike, twisting his arm, and sending him staggering into the dirt. The field went silent. For the first time, the untouchable colonel lay on the ground, his pride shattered before the eyes of his soldiers. Harlow scrambled up, his face red with rage. But Daniels's voice cut through the silence. "We've seen enough." Colonel Maya stepped forward, holding the secret folder high for all to see. "And so will command." Gasps erupted. Cadets turned to one another, whispers spreading like wildfire. Harlow's eyes widened. His empire of fear was collapsing, and he knew it. Emily stood firm, her voice carrying across the field. "You tried to break me, sir, but you only made me stronger. And now, everyone will know the truth." Piquet erupted not with fear, but with applause. For the first time, the base had found its courage, and Harlow had lost his power. The next morning, Fort Kingsley no longer felt the same. The whispers had grown louder, no longer fearful, but electric with anticipation. For the first time, the cadets were speaking openly about the toilet incident, the drills that nearly broke them, the punishments that went too far. The storm had broken. Inside the command building, a tribunal convened. High-ranking officers sat behind a long oak table, their uniforms pressed and medals gleaming. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone knew this hearing could shatter careers. Colonel Harlow entered first, his stride defiant, his jaw clenched. But there was something different in his eyes, just beneath the surface. Then Emily Carter walked in, flanked by Sergeant Daniels and Maya Torres. She carried the battered folder in her hands. Every eye in the room followed her. The lead officer cleared his throat. "Cadet Carter, you've requested this hearing to present evidence against Colonel Harlow. Proceed." Emily's palms sweated, but her voice was steady. She laid the folder on the table and opened it wide. "Sir, these are reports of press complaints, injury logs, testimonies all documenting Colonel Harlow's abuse of power. Soldiers silenced, careers destroyed. And last month," she paused, her throat tight, "he physically assaulted me, dunked my head in a toilet to teach me a lesson." A shocked murmur swept through the tribunal. Harlow slammed his fist on the table. "Lies, all of it. She's a weak cadet trying to save face after failing." But Daniels rose, his scarred face grim. "With respect, sir, I've served under Harlow for years. I witnessed his cruelty. I kept my own notes." He placed his own documents beside Emily's. Then Maya stepped forward. Her voice shook, but she stood tall. "I was one of his victims too. I was afraid to speak, but not anymore." One by one, Other cadets began to stand. From the back of the room, voices rang out, soldiers testifying, sharing stories long buried in silence. The weight of their words filled the room. Like thunder. The officers exchanged grim looks. The evidence was overwhelming. Finally, the lead officer turned to Harlow. Colonel Richard Harlow, you are hereby relieved of command pending court. You will answer for these charges. The color drained from Harlow's face. For the first time, the man who had ruled through fear looked small, powerless. Emily exhaled, her chest tight with relief. It wasn't over yet. The court-martial still loomed, but the base had seen the truth, and there was no going back. The tribunal's decision spread across Fort Kingsley like wildfire. By evening, every corner of the base knew Colonel Richard Harlow was finished. He had been stripped of his command, placed under guard, awaiting court-martial. For years, he had ruled through fear, but now, the whispers that once served him had turned into voices of defiance. Soldiers no longer averted their eyes, they stared openly, watching him marched away in disgrace. Emily Carter stood at the edge of the parade ground as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was painted in shades of crimson and gold, the air heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. She should have felt relief. Instead, what she felt was something deeper. Peace. Maya approached, her face glowing with quiet pride. You did it, Emily. Emily shook her head. We did it. All of us, Daniels. You. Every soldier who spoke up. A rough laugh sounded behind them. Sergeant Daniels, arms crossed, gave a small nod. You've got guts. Carter, you reminded this base what courage looks like. Don't lose that. For the first time in a long while, Emily smiled. The following week, during morning roll call, the commanding officer stepped forward. His voice carried strong and clear. Cadet Emily Carter, step out. Emily did, her boots striking firmly against the ground. You stood against abuse when others remained silent. You reminded this base that honor is not about rank, but about integrity. For your bravery, you are commended. The soldiers erupted in applause. The sound rolled across the parade ground, thunderous, unstoppable. Emily's chest tightened, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She had arrived at Fort Kingsley as an outsider, the foster kid who never belonged anywhere. She had endured humiliation, cruelty, and doubt, but she had not broken. And now, she stood not as a victim but as a symbol of strength. That night, Emily walked alone to the training field. The mud had dried, the ditch empty, the air cool and quiet. She stood in the same spot where Harlow had once tried to drown her spirit. She closed her eyes, breathing deep. You didn't break me. You made me stronger. When she turned back toward the barracks, the base lights glowed softly in the distance. Soldiers moved about, their laughter lighter, their steps freer. And though she didn't seek it, Emily knew something had changed. From now on, they would whisper her name, not with pity, but with respect. Cadet Emily Carter, girl who stood against a monster.